Were there any Florida-based Trafficante family mobsters who were more violent than Gambino soldier Roy DeMeo? Let's check it out. I'm James Gladwish and welcome to OC Shorts, bringing you detailed historical snapshots of the American Mafia and other organised crime. Feel free to subscribe if you like that sort of thing. Today, we're going to explore if any of the Trafficante family hitmen were more vicious than New York mobster Roy DeMeo. I caught up with Scott Deitche, a mob historian and author who is an advisor to the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. Scott wrote the book Cigar City Mafia, a comprehensive history of organised crime in Tampa, Florida. I asked Scott his opinion on the most vicious enforcers in the history of the Trafficante family, and if there were any who were worse than the likes of Gambino family soldier Roy DeMeo or Bonanno family mobster Tommy Pitera.
There were a few members of the Trafficante family and Tampa organized crime that kind of show up in relation to killings. In the 1930s, there was this war between Charlie Wall, who was known as the Dean of the Underworld, and the upstart Mafia. And there were a lot of gangland killings. And a name that popped up a few times was a gentleman named Joe Provenzano. He was a kind of a low-level member of the Tampa family. In fact, he may not even have ever been officially made into the Trafficante family, but he shows up in 1933 in the Mrs. Fernando Serrano killing. He's actually arrested, tried, and acquitted of the 1948 killing of Jimmy Velasco, who's this really important political fixer between the mob and the upper world. And he's present at the attempted murder of Paul Ferraro in 1953. So he's a name that kind of spins through some of these early gangland killings. Another name, or another couple names that show up in terms of just kind of being like the enforcers, guys that are linked to gangland violence, are Joe Badami and Joe Mistretta. The two of them are suspects in the 1955 murder of Charlie Wall. So Joe Mistretta, too, he's involved with an attack on Castellano in the early 1950s, where they literally beat the guy in the head with a hammer. Interestingly, Angelo Scalzo is involved in that. He earns the nickname the Hammer, and he's the father of the alleged successor to Santo Trafficante, Vincent Lascalzo. Another tough guy that I wouldn't say he's necessarily a tough guy, but he shows up around a lot of the murders is Johnny Scarface Rivera. And he was more of like the door opener, the guy who set up some of these gangland killings. And in his later years, he talked a little more openly to law enforcement about some of his time back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and organized crime in Tampa. And he mentioned that one of the interesting things about Tampa is they often imported shooters from out of town. There was James DeSimone and Nicholas Impastato from Kansas City in the 1930s who were coming into town and were implicated in a number of the murders, never charged. And also, he said that they would bring in kind of what he called a good old boy from around Jacksonville, Florida, and equipped to an undercover detective. Anytime I saw that guy around town, I knew someone was going to get shot. So yeah, it was kind of interesting that Tampa would sometimes reach outside the family to help with some of their internal strife.
But they didn't really have a reputation in terms of the likes of the Roy DeMeos out there, or your Greg Scarpas and great people like that.
No, there was never like one guy who was like, oh my God, that's the killer. That's the guy that, the go-to guy, like the Roy DeMeos, like you said, Tommy Pitera, those kind of figures. There was never like that singular figure in Tampa. It was kind of spread out, but there were certain guys that got involved in it. And there were certain guys that were known, just for gambling or just for different types of rackets and weren't really involved in the violence.
Because obviously a lot of New York guys came down to Florida, maybe not specifically Tampa. So obviously you had like Joe Stasi and Tony Plate. So obviously there were kind of killers who were coming into Florida. Did they ever work with the Tampa guys at all?
So there was a lot of overlap between Tampa crime figures and northern crime figures in South Florida, in Miami, and later in Broward, Palm Beach County. Certainly in the 1960s, the 70s, kind of like the heyday when all the families had operations in South Florida. Actually, I would extend that even further in the 80s. And in 1988, they estimated there was over 600 made guys and associates that were in South Florida. What was interesting is that everyone kind of got along. There was very little violence comparatively in Miami, North Bay Village, some of these areas where the northern mobsters were interacting with other families. So even though you had these stone cold killers from New York were coming down to Miami, they weren't really as involved in the violence down in South Florida as they were back home.
So, out of the names you kind of mentioned, who would you say was one of the most feared?
Oh, actually, I think it would probably Joe Badami and Joe Mastretta were two from people I've talked to and information I had that were kind of feared more and definitely were not afraid to use violence to get what they wanted.
I hope you found that interesting. Thanks for watching.